Thank you so much, Gary. It's a great honor to be with you today. I'm going to share my screen. So, the topic of my talk is rethinking energy in a time of environmental crisis. And I like to begin with this slide that shows it's a visual flow through chart of energy usage in the United States. And it's a kind of a technical chart that yet tells a very interesting story about modern energy. On the left-hand side, you see the sources of energy. And if you look closely, you'll see that despite all of the advances and improvements in renewable energy, in the United States, something less than 20% of our energy, of our total energy, comes from renewable sources. This is a much worse situation than Brazil finds itself in because of your long investments in hydropower over the decades. Also, you see, if you look all the way on the right-hand side of the image, you see this gray bar here that's called rejected energy. This is all the energy that's lost, mostly to the inefficiencies of converting chemical energy into mechanical energy. So you see that 2/3 or more of the energy that's burned, combusted, utilized in the United States actually goes to waste. And that's in part because of just the inefficiencies of the technologies and also the lack of attention and interest in conservation. A typical gas engine in a car only has about 20% efficiency, which means 80% of the energy is lost when you burn gasoline. So it's a very bad technology, but it's one that's being utilized widely because it's so effective at moving people quickly. And this sense of energy without attention to consequences is really part of the story I want to talk about, how we developed a modern energy system that, as my colleague David Hughes says, works with a logic of energy without conscience. So when we talk about the making of modern energy system, we have to think also about what came before it. And pre-modern energy, in fact, is very similar to the renewable energy future in terms of its sources that we aspire to. But you also see that, at least in terms of the place of Europe in this, that Europe is really a bit of a backwater. It's a bit marginal to the development of pre-modern energy. Most of the major inventions take place in Asia and the Middle East, and Europe itself is always on the fringes of technological invention. You could see some of the examples of these miraculous achievements in renewable energy still scattered around the world. These are the Noria water wheels from Syria. You can also look comparatively at the advancement of, say, China in sail technology before the 15th century, or the Polynesians as early as the 10th century AD, where their double-hulled voyaging canoes were able to make it from Asia, from New Guinea, all the way to the west coast of South America, bringing entire ecosystems with them, bringing pigs, bringing chickens, bringing plants, so that they could settle island after island. This was a skill in navigation and skill in sailboat making that was unknown in Europe for centuries later. It's also the case that when you think about how energy systems work, they don't tend to just fully replace each other. They're a bit like media forms in this way. Even though we don't use record players very much anyway, they continue to sort of have niche uses among hobbyists. Same with energy systems. We find that you can find peat-burning fireplaces still in existence, catamarans, still use that old sort of double-hulled voyaging technology, oxen, obviously, across the world. But something did change in the 15th century, and that's really where my story starts. It starts as European empires begin to span the globe, aspiring to trade with Asia, but overtaken soon by interests in land colonization, plantation formation, resource extraction, forced labor, and the organization of their transoceanic empires. With colonialism and empire came new energopolitics. And this is a term that I've coined to discuss the impact that energy systems have upon political formations. I'll talk more about it as we move through the lecture today. So the most important infrastructures of early modernity are sugar and coal. The plantation system, or as Donna Haraway puts it, the plantation scene, in so many ways is the epitome and the cutting edge of the modernization of social relationships, both among humans and between humans and the non-human world. As Haraway says, the plantation radically simplifies the number of players, sets up situations for the vast proliferation of some species and the removal of others. It depends on very intense forms of labor slavery, including also machine labor slavery, the building of machines for the exploitation and extraction of earthlings. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this plantation-scene economy and the sucropolitics, as I describe them, that accompany them in a minute. But also, we have to acknowledge, I quote here from energy historian Chris Jones, that the other major source of energy is coal, which he argues has arguably been the single most consequential energy transition in shaping the modern world order. And I don't think we have to think of these as alternate arguments. They're really all part of the same development. And I'll be talking about sugar, coal, and then oil in the course of a discussion of how the modern energy economy and energy system comes into being. So let's start with sugar and what I call the sucropolitical catalyst of European modernity. It's interesting that when Europe begins its expansion, the story we usually hear is that they were seeking trade with China, which isn't entirely inaccurate. But if you look at the actual pattern of Europe's expansion out of the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic Ocean, the pattern and the direction of colonization follows places that they're looking to create sugar plantations and to harvest sugar from. So sugar is in some ways the original vector of European colonial expansion. And you see that the Iberians work out of the Mediterranean to the Canaries and down all the way to Sao Tome off the west coast of Africa, where the first modern sugar plantations are created in the 1490s. Then they cross the Atlantic and begin to set up more sugar plantations in the Caribbean and in Brazil in the 1510s. Columbus, when he's going on his second voyage to the Americas, brings sugarcane clippings with him in the aim of cultivation. So you see from the very beginning, sugar is very much on the minds of European empire. Not long afterwards, because the African sugar plantations like Sao Tome are staffed with African slave labor, the first slave ships come across the Atlantic too in the 1520s. Within a couple of decades, commercial quantities of sugar are being shipped back to Europe from Brazil, from the Caribbean colonies like Santo Domingo. And that slave trade accelerates after 1650 to provide the labor power for the plantation scene. The European powers themselves compete for these sugar-making resources in the Caribbean, and this drives much of European warfare and colonial ambitions during the 17th and 18th century as, yes, the Spanish and the Portuguese, but also then the Dutch, then the British and the French all become involved in the sugar frontier. And in this world, to follow on Haraway's line of thinking, that the engine of modernity, in some sense, happens in the Caribbean and Brazil at this time. Catherine Youssef, the geographer, in her brilliant book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, writes about how in the New World, Europeans organized human property as extractable energy properties. It's interesting and ironic, perhaps, to think that most of the foundational works of European liberalism, the philosophy of the merchant middle classes and commercial middle classes, the property-owning middle classes, aspiring to overthrow the aristocracy and to establish their bourgeois social order in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, that most of the foundational works of their philosophy are published during the peak period of transatlantic slavery, whether that's John Locke's Second Treatise, Montesquieu's De l'Esprit des Lois, Rousseau's Discourse, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and so on and on. You can see that how the articulations of political freedom come hand in hand with the enslavement of African populations, creating the wealth, much of the wealth and the power of the middle classes in the New World. And the New World comes to occupy a very important role in the formation of European liberalism. I quote here from John Locke's second treatise, where he writes, there can be no clearer demonstration of anything than several nations of the Americans are of this, who are rich in land and poor in all the comforts of life, whom nature, having furnished as liberally as any other people with the materials of plenty, yet for want of improving it by labor, have not 1/100th the part of the conveniences we enjoy, and a king of a large and fruitful territory there feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day laborer in England. This is the same story we'll hear with Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations later, that even the poorest of the Europeans are wealthier than the inhabitants of the New World. And what's happening is that there's a huge problem within European liberalism, how to reconcile the sense of God's commons from Christianity, the sense that we were all bequeathed the world as a commons to enjoy and share, with the idea of private property, the idea that some people can own a portion of that commons only for themselves and their own benefit. And the New World is so pivotal to this reconciliation because it seemed to offer a place of limitless abundance, so that the industrial and rational Europeans who believed themselves more worthy of the resources of God's bequest than others, because they had not let them go to waste, they had developed them with their industry and their reason, that the Europeans could have more than their share without necessarily condemning anyone else to poverty. And so John Locke's liberalism offers a very powerful pretext for colonial dispossession, and one that honestly persists to this day. Indigenous peoples were given the same chances as anyone else by God, and yet they failed to improve their lands and their resources. They can then forfeit those claims to those, in other words, the Europeans, who have greater industry. Another problem was how to reconcile Christian ethics with widespread institutional slavery. And in fact, this is part of the reason why there's so little commentary upon actual African slavery within those classic texts of European liberalism. But they're little moments. They're little moments that offer clues. And Montesquieu mordantly comments that it's impossible for us to assume that these people, he means African slaves, are men, because if we assumed they were men, one would begin to believe that we ourselves were not Christians. There's a little bit of a clue there as to this paradox that's evolving within the context of European liberalism. There was no solution for it other than to create the sciences of racism that later flourished in the 19th century era of European empire, with their civilizational hierarchies and their foundational belief in the inferiority of non-white peoples. Sucropolitics reaches its peak in Haiti, then known as Saint-Domingue. With 3,000 plantations in the 1780s, Saint-Domingue is France's most valuable colony. It exports 60% of all the coffee and 75% of all the sugar consumed in Europe, more than all of Britain's so-called West Indian colonies combined. It's the crown jewel of transatlantic plantation capitalism, not just for France, but I would argue for all of Europe. 20% of the French bourgeoisie have their wealth tied directly to slave-related commercial activity. It's an enormous boost to the fortunes of those who would later seek to overthrow the aristocracy. And its slave economy is extremely robust in its murderousness. It imports up to 40,000 slaves a year, alone 1/3 of the Atlantic slave trade, yet those slaves, through overwork, disease, and murder, are turned over every 20 years. This leads ultimately to an uprising. After the French Revolution, there's an amazing story of revolution in Haiti, a bloody history to be sure, but one that effectively ends France's imperial ambitions, and in a sense, it brings an end to the heyday, the glory days of the sugar plantation capitalism too. But it's one that has a history that has a long series of after effects one of the reasons why Haiti moved from being the wealthiest colony in the New World to the poorest is because France and its European allies ultimately forced Haiti to pay enormous reparations for lost slaves and land, including payments on the debts that the government had to take out to pay the original debt back. These debt payments go on for almost 150 years. And this is part of why Haiti finds itself today in utter penury, of punishment, many feel, for the audacity of revolution. Well, after the Haitian Revolution, the plantation sucre politics and transatlantic capitalism begin to transform with a new emphasis on mechanization. Machines, of course, step in to the role of humans, and also the forms of non-human labor, cattle labor, for example, even water labor that had helped to fuel the plantation system. There's a marvelous book called The Birth of Energy by Kara Daggett, which I'd recommend, that tells the history of how back in Europe, the emphasis on mechanization leads to a new conceptualization of energy as work. It's a very complicated story in which the development of steam engines, the exigencies of empire, a new science of thermodynamics help all come together to cement a conceptualization of energy as work. The two laws of thermodynamics, energy is conserved within a system, but also that it dissipates within a system, that are sort of paradoxical when you think about it. This becomes an entire new modern worldview in which ultimately human beings are positioned as having to work constantly in order to preserve the divine order of the universe against the threats of entropy and decay. And this is part of why the modern industrial obsession with work reaches so deeply into our faith systems at the same time that it becomes, in a sense, one's duty and vocation in one's life to work on behalf of progress and modernity. Along with this comes a redefinition of civilizational hierarchy through capacities for work. You see this with Locke already, but it develops further during the 19th century. What Daggett calls an energetic racism, where some peoples are less able to work through the gift of technology, and thus those peoples who do not have technology are again rendered ready for dispossession and European imperial conquest. Fossil fuel use and wage labor are naturalized as social necessities for human improvement. Coal itself viewed as a gift, a divine gift, in order to remake this world and to keep entropy at bay. But this concept of energy, although we think of it as being modern, and I think Daggett makes a very good argument that it really comes into its own in the 19th century in places like Glasgow in England, in its sort of most pithy modern articulations. It's also a conception of energy that you can find in the Caribbean plantations. There's a plantation manual published in 1754 by Samuel Martin, in which he describes a plantation as a well-constructed machine with the energy and the right disposition of the mainsprings or primary parts. So this sense of society as machine-like is itself coming from the plantations. And it's little known that the first use of a steam engine for the purposes of industrial production comes not in Europe. This is the story we almost always hear, but it comes in Jamaica, in one of many experiments of ways of replacing human and animal labor with more easy to control machine labor. So this begins the second phase of the story I want to tell, the rise of carbopolitics, the rise of coal politics, which alongside plantation slavery has been, as Chris Jones argued, the single most important force in the modernization of society. Steam engines are intense areas of experimentation from the early 18th century, converting thermal energy to mechanical energy, powering the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century. They begin to be put towards different uses as the 18th and 19th century advance. By 1838, there are nearly 2,000 steam engines powering industry at the United States. And in just the last half of the 19th century, essentially the world moves from a wood-burning economy, a system of energy based on wood principally and plant products more generally, to one that's based on fossil fuels by the end of the 19th century. This leads to enormous transformations because through the generalization of industrial production, the so-called democracy of things comes into being. I'll just read, this is from Ian Barber, an essay by Ian Barber. The yardstick of a superior standard of living included not only basic necessities, but increasingly items that made life convenient, comfortable, and progressive. Items unimagined in 1800 or extremely expensive in 1815 were soon taken for granted as the rightful possessions of a large middle class. Bent pieces of iron were replaced by safety pins. Wax paper was superseded by large, cheap planes of window glass. The traditional flint and steel fire starter was replaced by the new final safety match. Americans of all classes came to believe they were entitled to these benefits produced by machines run by steam and water, and they wanted more. So the whole ethos of modern consumerism and of a culture founded upon the possession of items for convenience and luxury really takes shape with the rise of carbopolitics and coal-powered industrial production. Was this inevitable? Well, some, by looking at energy density, would say, yes, inevitably, we seek more denser energy sources. But according to historian and political theorist Andreas Malm, no, coal energy wasn't inevitable because of its density, but what was really decisive is how coal played into labor and capital relationships that helped to shepherd along the transition to a coal-based modernity. His marvelous book, Fossil Capital, tells the early story of industrialism and focuses on how England, which was the world's first industrial powerhouse, began the 19th century with its industrial machinery powered by water rather than by steam engines, and that this persisted really until the 1830s. Here's an example of an early water-based industrial machine, Richard Arkwright's water frame, which was used as a loom to power cotton production in England. But coal did win out because whereas water wheels required putting factories near rivers, sometimes in remote locations, places where it was difficult to find a labor population, where sometimes company towns would have to be set up, where industrialists would have to sort of raise and organize an entire workforce in a remote location. Coal could be burned anywhere, and it could be burned in any season. It could be burned during times of drought and times of flood. It won because of its flexibility and its ability to co-locate production power near labor power, and with that allowed industrialists much more leverage over labor power. If they could site their factories in places where there was an abundance of labor, at cheap labor, they could drive the price of labor down, and they could have a decisive upper hand in negotiations over how that labor power would be utilized. So by the middle of the 19th century, coal becomes the dominant enabling force behind European modernity, and its regime of mines, machines, and industrial relationships begins to globalize. Historian Leo Marx likes to talk about the locomotive as being an epitome of this period of time. By the 1830s, he writes, there was a widespread awareness that social change was rapidly accelerating, but the change did not yet have a generally accepted name, much less an explanation. Most of the words and catchphrases we now use to designate the great transition to modernity, industrial revolution, industrialization, the rise of industrial capitalism, urbanization, rationalization, mechanization. Either they had not yet been coined or had yet not won currency. But the technology of the locomotive comes to epitomize this sense that modern science and technology have given humanity a decisive decisive powers that are quasi-divine, powers that hitherto had only belonged to God, now are in the hands of humanity. The ability, it seems, to transcend space and time at miraculous speeds. As Marx puts it, the railroad became the Industrial Revolution incarnate in many parts of the world. This beautiful book called The Machine in the Garden. Indeed, coal use really reaches its peak then if the peak of the sucropolitical system was in the late 18th century in places like Santo Domingo, Saint-Domingue, you find that the peak of carbopolitics comes in the late 19th century, driven by steel, new chemical technologies, and of course, electricity. Coal and steel together enable the rise of new industrial and imperial powers in the United States and Prussia, with industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and Alfred Krupp pioneering the vertical integration of the steel industry. Late carbopolitics also sees industrialization and militarization expanding hand in hand, creating a new world order occupied by Euro-American coal, machines, and steel. And this all leads up really to a culminating point in the First World War. And you see here in this marvelous map of British coal exports, how important coal becomes to world trade. If sugar and other commodities like it had once dominated world trade, by 1900, coal constitutes 85% of British international trade being exported across the world. In fact, the very concept of the Middle East, it's interesting, refers to the organization of coal supply stations as British coal steamships ferry their way across the world, bringing this essential fuel to the expanding imperial dominions across the world. You see it here, how much Britain stands at the center of this carbo-political nexus. But in a story that's told very well by the historian Timothy Mitchell, there were limits to coal-fueled industrial capitalism and the carbon democracy that it became associated with. What Mitchell means by carbon democracy was the capacity of coal miners to actually gain decisive political leverage over modern industrialists by utilizing their deep sense of political alliance and fraternity, also with steelworkers, to shut down or to threaten to shut down the modern economy by, for example, blockading coal routes across rail in ways that were more effective than any other kind of political action in the 19th and early 20th century at yielding political gains, like, for example, the 40-hour work week or the 8-hour work day, the end of child labor. All of these victories for the modern workers' movement were won when coal workers and steel workers led projects of political resistance. That meant that coal workers had an enormous political, enormous political power that Mitchell argues became a problem for the organization of capital in the 20th century. And part of what decisively prompted a shift from coal to oil, because coal, because of its energy density and its materiality, required sending a lot of human labor underground into very dangerous conditions to retrieve it. Oil, on the other hand, was pressurized from below, and if you poked a hole in the right place, it would come shooting up in a geyser. Oil required much less human labor to organize. It required it didn't have the same kind of vulnerabilities to political blockage because it could be shipped by boat rather than across land by rail very easily. And that meant that an oil economy in some ways was an economy that would be more amenable to industrial control with a weaker labor class. And so this is the story that Mitchell tells in his book, Carbon Democracy, about how both the essential rights of social democracy are won through the coal economy, and then how they begin to be dismantled as the coal economy gives way to an oil economy after the Second World War. In this same period of time, Oil, which is viewed at the beginning as an inexhaustible resource, helps fuel the 20th century conception of growth and of the sense of the economy as being a site of political and social intervention. Before the 1930s, Mitchell argues, there was no conception of the economy in its modern sense, but the idea of the economy, specifically a national economy, as something that existed and should constantly grow, is something that he sees as a petro-knowledge, as an expert knowledge form that's associated with the material basis of an oil economy. Alongside this work on growth, I also think we need to pay attention to the importance of plastics, the growth of a plastics industry based on petroleum derivatives that also then comes to inform all sorts of modern luxuries and conveniences. That democracy of things that was put into the world by coal transforms because of oil and plastics till we became, if you will, awash in all sorts of cheap plastic-based commodities too. This is critical for global consumerism. It's critical to expand global petroculture, and we enter into an era of cheap goods and rampant energy use without regard for environmental and social consequences. And you can see when you look at this chart of energy consumption in the United States, just how really since 1900, the use of energy skyrockets, but especially since 1950. The era of petroculture is an era of enormous growth in energy use. When you think about what petropower is today, I like to say, look for the pipelines, look for the hidden infrastructural systems that actually enable the delivery of this critical resource for global modernity. And you can show maps like this in any country, and they tell important stories, I think, about power. If you were to look at this image on the left of the United States, it's interesting to think about this as a political map, right? Because we tend to think of the United States as being dominated politically and culturally by the coasts, by the East Coast, the center of finance and the center of political power, the West Coast, the center of culture and entertainment, all of the sort of great soft power outputs that the United States produces. But if I were to show this map to somebody who knew nothing about the United States, and I said, where's the center of power? You would say, well, it's in Texas, it's in Oklahoma, it's in Louisiana. That's where the pipelines are. And indeed, this is where much of the economic power of the United States resides. And it's why a place like Texas wields this enormous amount of political influence in the country today, just as, for example, Alberta does in Canada, because it is the nexus of petropower, the materialization of the supply of oil. Of course, petropower is not just about production, it's about the human impacts too. And so I want to recognize that the devastation of petropower is felt inequally, that it's often the poorest and most vulnerable populations. This image on the left is a neighborhood of Houston called Manchester, which is entirely encircled by refineries and other industrial facilities. It has cancer-causing pollutants at about 20 times the level that the more affluent areas of Houston have. And this is an example also of how petropower manifests itself in our social environment. I'm coming to the end of the first part of the talk of the history of modern energy, and people want to know what's coming. We talk much about energy transition, what's coming after these regimes of sucro, carbo, and petro. And I say it's most likely electricity. It's most likely the next phase of energy. The next energy regime to dominate will be electrical. There are robust electrical political infrastructures already existing in the world. They've been there since the beginning of the 20th century. There was a moment in the 1970s where it looked as though indeed the world would shift away from oil towards nuclear-powered electricity, but for a variety of reasons, I'm sure you know many of them, that didn't happen. But now again, because of the climate emergency, there is a movement towards the fusion of energy and electricity. The idea of electrify everything has become a mantra of climate experts across the world. Yet I want to be clear that by itself, electrical infrastructure is unlikely to disrupt the trajectory of modern energy that's been set by Sucro, Carbo, and Petro. If history is any guide, it's more likely that electroculture will emerge deeply shaped by the grooves of petroculture, just as petroculture was heavily influenced by carboculture and sucroculture that preceded it. We're already seeing, for example, many experts demanding more power plants, more grid, new resource frontiers for resources like lithium, so that electroculture can meet the needs and exceed the pace of petrocultural expansion. In other words, people imagine that electricity will sort of green this capitalist system, but that will allow it to continue to grow infinitely. And it's a deceptive idea. I don't think that an electrified version of petroculture actually is capable of responding to our contemporary conditions of environmental emergency. It will take more, but also in interesting ways less, to remake a world that breaks with these traditions, this ecocidal trajectory we've inherited. In the second part of my remarks, which will be a bit shorter, I want to talk about decarbonization and what has been called degrowth or décroissance is as a part of rethinking how much energy has to be rethought and remade in our time of environmental crisis. So the stakes of the climate emergency, I think, are well known to you. I don't want to go on and on about things that you probably already know, but you see from the trends on the left-hand side that no matter what kind of concerted international effort has been put towards reining in greenhouse gas emissions, they have not been able to so far make any kind of notable impact on the curve of environmental destabilization. And there are many, many possible negative scenarios that could come out of this. The worst case being that we'll have increasingly unstable Earth systems, leading to an Earth that becomes uninhabitable in places, and that may lead to civilizational collapse. I think one of the things you learn as an anthropologist looking at different cultures across the world and across time is that whereas human beings are very, very resilient and adaptable at a sort of individual or small group level, civilizations are actually much more fragile and more prone to collapse. And when they collapse, it's often because of ecological reasons that they collapse and then sort of disperse, and humanity is forced to reinvent itself socially again. Now, there are two arguments that high energy industrial productivity and economic growth are infinitely sustainable. There are basically two kinds of arguments that suggest the trajectory that we're on can actually be maintained. And the first is basically technological salvation, the idea that something like nuclear fusion will be developed, combined with advances in material science and recycling that will allow us to have all the energy we need cheaply without significant environmental consequences. This has been a dream since the dawn of nuclear power in the 1940s, but it continues to be deferred. When I was a boy, I used to hear that nuclear fusion was about 20 years away from being a reality. That was maybe 40 years ago. And now today, we are still 20 years away from it being a reality again. So the horizon keeps to move forward. It's not really, just to speak honestly, it's not really a reasonable horizon. It's sort of a fantasy. It's a hallucination that technological salvation will save us. The other argument is that we can decouple economic growth and industrial activity from the negative consequences of high energy usage through a green energy transition, as well as perhaps some developments in efficiency and so on, so that economic development can proceed without increasing an environmental burden. Unfortunately, this latter model, which seems reasonable on the face of it, has now been pretty decisively disproven by a lot of economic studies that have looked at the problem of absolute decoupling. Relative decoupling is the idea that you can, let's say, green your own national economy. And Sweden famously was able to do this and show that, oh, look, in Sweden, the national economy has gotten greener over time. It's using less. It's using less carbon, high carbon energy, and thus its carbon emissions profile is declining. And this was celebrated as very good news about 10 years ago. But then some economists said, well, but you're only looking at what you're producing in the country. You're not looking at the carbon footprint of all the different high energy goods that now you've outsourced to Asia. So China is sort of taking up all of the old high energy emissions for the entire world, essentially. And it allows places like Sweden to look like they are greener, but in fact, when you take in consumer emissions too, it becomes a much different story. And absolute decoupling looks at production emissions and at consumption emissions together. And then you see when you put that all together, it actually is very, very difficult to decouple growth, economic growth from carbon emissions. And so there are studies, I won't go into them in great detail, that show that it is possible to decouple for short periods of time, but just as easy to recouple again. And that the study found that of the 22 countries that had managed to decouple between 2010 and 2015, they had also recoupled again after 2015. So the only way to absolutely decouple is to entirely transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. But this is something that many experts feel is impossible to do on the timescale that is available to us, because, for example, in our contemporary circumstances, we are growing the demand for energy globally much faster than we're able to install new renewable technology. So every year we're actually falling farther and farther behind, despite the fact that the energy transition is becoming more and more active. In 2022, the world will add 35 gigawatts of new renewable energy production, which is the most in modern history. It's a tremendous achievement, and I don't want to suggest it's not. It's amazing that we can do this now. But unfortunately, we will be adding 100 gigawatts of global energy demand, which means those other 65 gigawatts will be coming from non-renewable sources. Our carbon emissions will go up in 2022 globally relative to 2021 for this reason. So even though we're having tremendous successes, they aren't enough. They aren't enough. In my own research with Simony Howe, who I think you may know, we've studied what happens when you undertake decarbonization without a degrowth model. We've studied the case of wind power development in southern Mexico, the densest concentration of onshore wind parks anywhere in the world, an amazing achievement, again, to bring about 2.8 gigawatts of renewable energy onto the Mexican grid in a period of less than 10 years, a remarkable achievement. But it's an achievement that came with enormous social costs. Many indigenous communities in this part of Mexico felt that they weren't consulted properly, that this development happened without their consent, and they feel as though they're not benefiting from it. There was a tremendous amount of political resistance that grew to this wind power development project over the period of time we were doing research in Mexico. And in the end, the political contention became so strong that the development process ceased. It was because the development was really for the benefit, let's say, of the Mexican national economy, perhaps of the global economy, but not very attentive to the interests and the histories of colonization in this region. People were very sensitive to the idea of external extraction of local resources without a sense of any benefit to the local communities. And so this kind of development, which is likely to happen if we have to do things very, very rapidly, will only increase. And unfortunately, many communities in this area felt as though there was nothing new or renewable about this energy development at all. It felt very extractivist. They described wind parks in the same breath as mines, which is tragic, I think, but very understandable. And so this kind of development, in fact, in the end, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. it's creating more wind parks, but it's not really doing much to address the issues of why wind parks had to be built in the first place. And this is part of the summary that we offered in our 2 books on the project. These 2 books are available open access for free. If you type the titles into your search engine and open access, you can download a copy. And we'd be very happy if you did and read more about this study, because it's much more complex than I can give it proper treatment here in this short amount of time available to me. But I think it raises some very important questions about rapid renewable energy development and its capacity to actually break with the kinds of toxic relationships that, again, made it necessary to build wind parks in the first place. So I'm going to end with a few remarks on degrowth as an alternative response. Degrowth is a concept that emerged in response to the Club of Rome's Limits of Growth report in 1972. That report raised real questions about the present growth trends in the world, population, industrialization, pollution, food production, resource depletion. And it said or predicted that the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The most probable result will be a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. That's a nice way of saying the collapse of civilization, essentially. This was a prediction that was made 50 years ago. It's not inaccurate in terms of what's happened in the past 50 years, and it raises real questions about what the next 50 years will bring. Perhaps not the end of that we will run out of oil, which is what was feared in the 1970s, but rather that the pollution resulting from the use of oil, in this case greenhouse gas emissions, will bring down, create real crises of both production, food supply, and so forth for the world. The term degrowth, or in its original French, décroissance, was coined in the debates that emerged after the Limits to Growth report was published. The man who coined the term is named André Gortz, a very interesting Marxist ecological philosopher. And he asked, what is it we want? A capitalism adapted to ecological constraints, or a social, economic, and cultural revolution that abolishes the constraints of capitalism and in so doing establishes a new relationship between individual and society, between people and nature? Do we want reform or revolution? And Gortz himself, as a Marxist, perhaps predictably, he wanted revolution because he saw that the growth orientation of capitalist society was something inherent to its operation. Capitalism uses scarcity as a means for reproducing social inequality and preserving hierarchy in its class structure. New technological achievements and luxuries are enjoyed first only by the elite, and that attracts the desires of the masses towards them. But as the masses gain access to these old luxuries, new unattainable luxuries develop to replace them. And this is a kind of a treadmill effect that means that there never will be a universal good life enjoyed in a capitalist society, no matter how much it accumulates useful things. And he describes this process as the poverty of affluence. And you can see it also happening in the renewable energy transition, where so much effort is put towards creating Tesla cars and, very expensive solar roof shingles that will benefit only a small group of people, that become desirable status commodities. Much less effort is put towards interventions like better public transportation, things that might actually help to benefit society as a whole. Gortz himself imagined the world of décroissance as one that was defined by universally available, highly durable goods, beautiful public dwellings and transportation, a 20-hour work week, with focused just on providing essential needs with the remaining time left over for creative self-realization. This is also, if you have read Marx himself, sort of his argument for a post-capitalist society too. He saw it Gortz, that is, not as a utopian project, but really as a matter of what he called ecological realism, because we need to actively slow down the pulse of modernity, but to consume less and less, to conserve what we have available for future generations. And what Gortz was writing about in the 1970s sounds very contemporary today. It could be voiced by any number of degrowth activists 50 years later. Degrowth has become not just a sort of small movement, which it was until the past decade, but it's become quite a bit larger. And it's gained allies too in the global south when you think about, say, the Zapatista uprising against neoliberal globalization, and against the sort of the premise of growth as being the objective for a world economy. People in the South, of course, know that growth has this very dark and violent side to it. They've known that for centuries, literally. And there's an argument that I think degrowth awareness is a way that the North is discovering what the South has always known, that this kind of capitalism, this carbo petro capitalism, is predatory, and it creates its luxuries for the few on the basis of miseries for the many. We've seen now that degrowth is becoming part of more established economics, that there's a whole subfield of ecological economics that I think is one of the most exciting parts of economic theory today. Work by folks like Kate Raworth and Jorgis Kallis theorizing degrowth as a program of civilizational transition, a rallying cry politically too, in many respects, a rallying cry that's been echoed also by people working from the perspective of ecofeminism, from the perspective of indigenous sovereignty, showing that this growth ideology is deeply patriarchal. It depends upon the resilience of women's caring labor as the underlying infrastructure for all of its extractive practices. Also, indigenous movements towards replacing the petrocultural growth economy with a caretaking economy, a true sustainable economy, rather than one that sort of greens itself superficially, but continues on this relentless extractive mission. And, if we want to think about how this degrowth trajectory could be achieved, there are a lot of increasing number of books about this that I think are very helpful as guidelines. I like Jason Hickel's book, Less is More, as an example. And he makes it clear that degrowth doesn't mean shutting everything down at once. He says it's a more rational approach to considering what sectors we actually need to grow, like public transportation and renewable energy, and what sectors are clearly too big and should be scaled down, like SUV production, private cars, military industry, advertising, and so on. Huge chunks of our economy are totally irrelevant to human well-being. We must ask ourselves, do we really want to pursue aggregate growth if it's going to put our planet and our civilization at such extraordinary risk? And I think these are really the front lines of the reconceptualization of energy and economy today. You might ask, and again, it's the global south it's the global north that needs to hear this, not the global south. The global north are the problem here. They are the ones who are creating the ecological destabilization. So you might wonder, are these policies gaining any traction? Are they really changing anything? I would say only so far at an experimental level. But at the experimental level, for example, in places like Barcelona and Amsterdam, there are some interesting early experiments in creating a solidarity economy with some encouraging results. I'm thinking especially of cooperatives like Som Energia and Som Mobilitat that are offering more than just conventional energy services. They are promoting greater senses of energy literacy and conservation. They're helping their customers learn to use less power. They're operated not as for-profit entities, but as cooperatives. And they're even finding ways to bring a sense of play into it. They're organizing, energy efficiency races as a way of sort of making the process of energy transition not just hard work and sacrifice, but something that also has a certain amount of joy and possibility in it. We also know that this winter, because of what's happening in Ukraine, that much of Europe is going to engage in an ambitious degrowth exercise in energy usage. And we'll see what happens from that. I think there's a lot of anxiety, but it could actually help accelerate a positive transition. I think there's a good chance that one of the few silver linings to this insane war is that Europe may find itself weaning itself off power in important ways and more quickly. And even the United States, which is a place that's filled with contradictions and polarizations. There are certain states like California, Hawaii, New York, and Washington that are really taking the degrowth of energy seriously, although how these will contribute to a broader degrowth politics in the United States are unclear. So I'm at my hour right now, and I just want to thank you for your patience. And I hope Laura, I hope I went okay. The pace was okay, because there was a lot of material there. But I'll just say thank you again, wishing you your own bright future of degrowth. I have here an image to a book of the field of energy humanities, which I've had the benefit of and honor of helping to co-create, that would love to hear your thoughts and of course to hear your questions. So thank you.